What's up, hockey fans? Welcome to the Wraparound, brought to you by the Hockey News. I'm your host, Emma Lingan. I am joined today by Michael Augello and Kelsey Surmacz of the Hockey News. Got lots to talk about today, but before we get into all of the latest and greatest storylines from around the NHL, I do want to remind you that for over 75 years, the Hockey News has been the ultimate hockey fix. Now get 12 issues delivered straight to you, packed with stories, stats, and a bonus gift issue to kick things off. Head over to thn.com and get in on the action. All right, you guys, we have got lots to get into today. First of all, I want to talk about the Edmonton Oilers because I feel like we always have to have something to say about the Edmonton Oilers. They're just a content machine, and we love that in the off season especially. But, you know, as we've talked about before, the urgency to win in Edmonton, to win a Stanley Cup in Edmonton has been sky high, really ever since Stan Bowman took over as general manager 2 summers ago. They have Connor McDavid signed through the 2027-28 season. He has been adamant about playing for a winner. We've talked about how that was kind of a last chance for them, him signing that short-term deal to kind of give them a chance to become a winner while he's still on the team. Now, as we've talked about at length this offseason, the Oilers hired Mike Babcock as their head coach. They re-signed deadline ads, guys like Connor Murphy, Jason Dickinson. They signed Freddie Anderson, a Stanley Cup winning goaltender, and they parted ways with Darnell Nurse. So lots going on in Edmonton this offseason. And Stan Bowman actually said during an appearance on TSN last week that he's happy with where the Oilers are at right now and where they stand. Now, granted, as a general manager, I'm not sure what else you're supposed to say when you're talking about your team heading into the regular season here. But Mike, do you agree? Would you be happy with where this team is right now? Or what do you think about the Oilers heading into next season?
Emma, you stole my line. What else is he going to say? If he says they screwed up, they should fire him right now. I mean, I don't like what they did. I don't like Mike Babcock as a coach. He's been a failure ever since he left Detroit. He was a failure in Toronto. He's alienated players. This is a home run throw because they're hoping that, you know, he can find his magic and draw something out of the existing roster. If you look at their roster from a couple years ago that went to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final, it is significantly better than the roster that they have right now. I think they're maybe a playoff team, but I think they're fighting for a wild card more than a top 3 spot in the Pacific. Any other division in the NHL, they wouldn't be top 3, but in the Pacific, since it's weak, they have a chance at that. But I am not impressed, and I don't think they're a Stanley Cup contender.
Well, Kelsey, I don't know about you, but the coaching hire in particular, I have a really hard time seeing this ending well. But when you combine that with the roster moves that they have made, I mean, do you think it's enough to kind of get over that hump this year?
I don't. I'm in agreement with Mike here. I mean, I think, first of all, everybody knows the Mike Babcock hire was risky for a number of reasons. But Mike kind of hit the nail on the head. You know, this guy hasn't even been a successful coach since his days, early days with the Red Wings. So, I mean, we're looking at a coach that hasn't had success in the last 2 tenures he's had. You're bringing him into a situation where there's a lot of rocky relationships with players. And there's a lot of questions around the locker room with Mike Babcock. Obviously, they want to build a winning culture. Mike Babcock has one, but it was a really long time ago and a very different time in the NHL. So it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out and how he meshes with the Stars, with Connor McDavid, with Leon Draisaitl, how those relationships kind of pan out for them, because I think that might make a big difference. As far as the roster itself, I don't think they've done enough to really address what their holes are. They're still weak on defense. They did add Ryan Shea. Got rid of Darnell Nurse. So I think that that's kind of a plus for them on the left side because Ryan Shea is a pretty responsible defender. So at least that'll shore up some of the defensive issues, hopefully, on that bottom pairing. But as Mike said, this roster is worse than the one that got to the Stanley Cup final a couple of years ago. I don't think their window is getting any bigger. I don't think it's extending. I think it's starting to close a little bit. So if they don't do anything this year, there's going to be big changes. But I still think some big changes have to happen ahead of the deadline, assuming they're in the race for them to be able to go all the way this year.
Well, speaking of changes, and that leads us right into the next thing I want to ask you about, Kelsey. Obviously, having you here on the show today, I want to ask you about the Pittsburgh Penguins. They have undergone plenty of changes to their roster this offseason as well. So they brought in guys like Andrei Kuzmenko, Nick Robertson, Hendrix Lapierre, Trevor Van Riemsdyk, Declan Carlisle, Kaden Korczak. At the same time, obviously, they got rid of a lot of pieces. So guys like Anthony Mantha, Nola Chari, Ryan Shea, who you mentioned, Parker Weatherspoon, Kevin Hayes, Jack St. Ivany, and then obviously Stuart Skinner in goal. So the Penguins really have no room for regression this upcoming season, especially after the rest of the Metro division got better as well. So do you think that Pittsburgh still plans to make a bigger trade to kind of bolster their roster both in the short term and the long term? Or do you think this is kind of what the team is going to look like heading into this season?
I'm not ruling out another move from Kyle Dubas. He does famously like to make trades in August. So we'll see. We still have a little bit of August runway in front of us. But also, too, I mean, Kyle Dubas said this during the draft. They tried to make a few moves. They tried to dabble in the market. They tried to go big game hunting, as was suggested. But it just didn't work out. The prices were too high. They weren't willing to pay what was necessary to get some of these guys. And we saw Washington add guys like Alex Tuch, Jordan Kyrou. So there's teams around them improving in the division. They've made minimal improvements to their roster, I think. I think Nick Robertson, Andrei Kuzmenko are both upside guys. Kuzmenko might be able to replicate Mantha's production if put in a position to succeed and if he's healthy. So, I mean, they've done enough to replace some of what they lost last year. But we also have to remember that last season, Kyle Dubas, I don't know how he wasn't in the GM of the Year conversation last year because all of the moves he made last season panned out. You talk about Parker Wotherspoon moving to the Vegas Golden Knights for Kaden Korczak. Parker Wotherspoon was a chance signing that he took, worked out. They traded for Artur Shilovs. That ended up working out for them pretty well. He signed another deal to remain with the team this year. So I think a lot of the same kinds of moves were made this summer to kind of take a chance on the guy kind of moves. We saw the Ville Koivunen contract. We saw the Igor Kuchenikov contract. So they have some pieces, but they still need that guy. They still need a superstar. They're going to have young players pushing. That's another thing I don't think Dubas has necessarily gotten enough credit for is how he's built out this prospect pool for the Penguins. They have a lot of NHL-type talent, not necessarily superstar talent, but there are a lot of guys that should be on the NHL roster starting this season. So they're going to have a combination of a youth push, some of these guys panning out, but also they still need to make that big splash. They have the assets to do it. So I do expect something at some point this season, whether that's before the deadline, sometime on a random day in November, who knows? But I do think something else is coming, especially if they start off the season pretty well here.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You talk about them still kind of needing that guy, Kelsey. Anyone who comes to mind as a particular, like a target, a kind of guy, a kind of player they might be looking to target here?
Yeah, I mean, obviously they need a center. They love what they're seeing from Ben Kindle. Obviously, they expect a little bit of a progression from him going forward. They think he's going to be a top six center. I still think they're keeping an eye on the Jason Robertson situation, if I had to guess. We know that that's kind of been in Kyle Dubas's back pocket. He was poking around, so I do think he's somebody that's still a high-value target if that situation, circles back around come January. But I mean, if we're thinking of some targets, Elias Pettersson makes some degree of sense if they can get him for the right price. And if Elias Pettersson is willing to leave Vancouver, which is a big question mark. I'm also looking at Adam Fantilli, some of these other younger centers, Shane Wright, some of these upside guys that might not be first line center talents, but could help bolster their top six and potentially grow into something more because those are the kinds of players Dubas likes to target. But if we're going superstar, I wouldn't rule out Jason Robertson. Still, I think they're still probably in the back door there, just trying to waiting on that situation, waiting it out. But I'd say probably Fantilli and Pettersson and Wright are three names to maybe keep an eye on.
Yeah, Mike, we know that the Jason Robertson situation, we have been monitoring that all off season. Of course, we know now he's headed back to Dallas for one more year. But again, if Kelsey is, like Kelsey mentioned, if that situation comes up again, if he's not able to re-sign long-term with Dallas, could you see him ending up in Pittsburgh? Or do you see Pittsburgh, making another move to that degree to sort of bolster their forward group?
I mean, I think Kelsey's right on target in terms of them looking for center help. You've got Malkin, who's older than Methuselah, and Sidney Crosby is still great. But if they hope to, and honestly, I don't think it's realistic that they're going to be a contender. I think they could make the playoffs like they did last year, but I think, it might be time that if they take a step back this year, that they trade Erik Karlsson before the deadline as a rental, that they give Rutger McGroarty and Owen Pickering, and we know Miroshov is going to be one of the goaltenders, but it might be the time to start the youth movement and move out some of the older players. We talked about Raquel and Russ being traded before last year. They still have term on their deals, and they're still attractive players, so that might be where Dubas goes if things don't turn out well.
Well, we talked about the Atlantic Division, the Metro Division getting stronger, but the Atlantic Division has also gotten a lot stronger this offseason. So I want to look specifically at the Boston Bruins, because this is a team that had a relatively successful season last year. They improved by 12 wins over the year before, which pushed them into a playoff spot after they finished fourth in that really competitive Atlantic Division that, again, has only continued to get stronger. So the division has been improving considerably. I mean, teams like the Panthers, of course, expected to make a run for it again here now that they're healthy. The Toronto Maple Leafs have made a bunch of changes to their roster under a new front office. So Mike, in your opinion, do you think the Bruins have done enough this offseason to stay competitive in the Atlantic? And what more, if they do need to add anything, where would you target improving that roster?
They have not. They pretty much stood pat. I mean, Arvidsson left, and they replaced him with J.J. Peterka, who is a younger, better version in terms of scoring, but not as good defensively as Arvidsson. They added Will Borgen on the blue line. They're going to go with Michael DiPietro as the backup instead of Eunice Korpisalo. So they made I think DiPietro could be better than Korpisalo, but remember that increase from that 12-win increase was because Jeremy Swayman had a bad year 2 seasons ago, and Charlie McAvoy was hurt at Four Nations, and they dropped like a stone at the end of the year. They're really depending on a lot of youngsters like Fraser Minton to take a next step. He's not a number 1 center. He's probably a number 3, but he could take a next step. They're hoping James Higgins comes into the lineup and scores. But their problem and where they need to add is where everybody needs to add, and it's almost impossible to get. They're not strong up the middle. They have players who can play center, but Elias Lindholm hasn't lived up to the expectations of the free agent contract. Pavel Zacha had a 30-goal season. Morgan Geekie had a 39-goal season. I don't know if I expect those players to reach those marks again. So I think by standing pat or basically doing a little, they're falling back.
Yeah, you had, like you said, a couple years ago, Swayman took a step back, McAvoy was injured, and then now you have sort of outlier performances this past season, like Geekie, not to take anything away from him, but I don't know that you necessarily count on him to replicate that kind of production again this year. So Kelsey, if you're looking at this Bruins team and then looking out at the rest of the division, do you think they've done enough to actually stay afloat in this division?
Like Mike said, I think they made a lot of lateral moves. I don't think that anything necessarily improved their roster. As he said, they kind of stood pat. Anything they did was, again, more of a lateral move than an upward move, so to speak. And they are really banking on some of those younger players to take steps next year. And I think that's a big part of the equation here. But to answer your question, I don't think they've done enough to really separate themselves at all. They might stay afloat like they did last season. I don't think this situation is too dissimilar from Pittsburgh, aside from, the really old center aspect of it. But I think to some extent, they have parts of their roster that are aging a little bit. They have some of these younger players that are pushing, like Mike mentioned earlier. but they still need that center help. They still need a little bit more of a boost. I still do think they need an elite center down the middle at some point, which isn't easy to find, as Mike said. That usually comes either through drafting in the lottery zone, or basically putting all your pieces on the line for a big trade. And I'm not sure they have the assets to do that. So I think they're in a little bit of a tough spot. This is a team that doesn't quite have the pool, I think, to make a major move, as some of the other, teams in this situation might be able to. So I think they're kind of ride it out. I hope that Swayman has another outstanding season. Hope that Geekie has another outstanding season. I think they're banking on a lot of those guys to replicate what they did last season, but it's not a safe thing to bank on. I think they need to start making moves. And if they're going to stay in contention, they also need to make some kind of big move down the middle. I agree with Mike there.
Well, like you mentioned, the goaltending is going to be significant in Boston as well. You want to see Swayman continue on that track that he was on this last year. And, goaltending, important for any team around the league. One team in particular that I am looking at when it comes to goaltending this year is the New Jersey Devils, because remember, they traded Jacob Markstrom to the Florida Panthers after they lost Sergei Bobrovsky to the Maple Leafs. So now the Devils are kind of headed down this path of goalie rotation, like a three-headed monster situation. Maybe monster isn't the correct word, but a three-headed goalie situation. I think they've got three goalies under contract right now. You got Jake Allen, Nico Daws, and David Riddick. Mike, from covering Buffalo that sometimes when you have three goalies, it means you have no goalies. So I want to kind of get your take on the goaltending situation in New Jersey, and who do you think is going to end up playing the most games of the three?
Their goaltending situation right now is, to me, disastrous, because I think you've got Heishier and Hughes up the middle. You've got some good forwards. Their defense is pretty decent. Dougie Hamilton bounced back last year. I think Luke Hughes has got a lot of talent. But the goaltending could undermine all of that. I mean, Nico Daws, who a lot of people are saying should be the starter, he's 25 years old. Look at his statistics. In the American Hockey League, he had under 900 save percentage the last 3 years, with over almost 100 games in the American Hockey League. Now, he played better at the NHL level in spot duty, but I wouldn't feel confident going into the season with Nico Daws as my number one goaltender. And Jake Allen is a fine veteran guy, and big game David Rittich is, a good number three. But really, they should be in the Connor Hellebuck sweepstakes, and them not be. And maybe that's where things will go. But right now, I think that this goaltending situation to me could lead to them missing the playoffs and Sheldon Keefe being the first coach fired in the NHL.
Do you think that this team is significantly worse without Jacob Markstrom, or do you think that Sunny Mehta should have gone out and actually gotten a legit number one goaltender?
I mean, Markstrom is the big question mark in Florida because he didn't play well in New Jersey. So I don't know how much worse they are with a aging Markstrom than they are with the guys that they have right now. But they needed to upgrade the goaltending. That's why they got Markstrom in the first place. And now I don't think they're much better. They're back to where they were before they got Markstrom.
Yeah, Kelsey, it's tough looking at any of these three guys, Allen, Daws, Riddick, like none of them really stands out head and shoulders above the other as yes, this is your number one goaltender. So what do you predict happens here in New Jersey with this goaltending situation? Do you think that it will be Daws who's given most of the starts? Arguably may not have earned them, but I mean, sometimes it's just a matter of having the opportunity.
Personally, I think this is a wait and see situation. I agree with Mike that it's kind of wild that they're not. Obviously no one's acquired Connor Hellebuck yet, but they should be in on that. Because this is something, I agree, it's kind of a disaster for them. You can't rely on a guy who's had a sub 900 save percentage, who's 25 years old. He's probably at the point where he should start at least progressing in some kind of sense, and maybe he does this season. I do think he gets a fair share of the starts, and also too, it's worth considering that the other two guys are in their mid to late 30s. So this is something, I don't think this is a long-term solution for them. I think this is kind of their attempt at throwing stuff at the wall, seeing what sticks. And if Dawes can give them, serviceable goaltending, they'll try to work with that, because I don't think this roster is necessarily non-competitive. Otherwise, I think they, as Mike said, they have a good group of forwards. They have a decent core on defense. They probably could serve to add there a little bit, but in general, goaltending is going to be their downfall if they end up near the bottom of the division again. So I think this is the situation. They're going to give Dawes some runway, see what he has, see what he can do. They have, some insurance with Allen and Rittich, but again, it's not a long-term solution. If they're going to be contenders and they're going to get back into the conversation for the Metropolitan Division, they need to get a goaltender, whether that's developing a young goaltender, acquiring someone, or acquiring a sure bet like Connor Hellebuck. So they definitely need to be in the goaltending market if they're going to sniff the playoffs this season, I think.
Well, I want to circle back here to something we mentioned earlier, talking about the Pittsburgh Penguins, the whole Jason Robertson situation in Dallas. So I want to actually circle back to that and talk about the Dallas Stars, because this is now yet another year, they failed to make it to the Stanley Cup final. And, Robertson is on that 1-year deal now, uncertain future beyond that. They had a really quiet offseason otherwise in Dallas. And, Tyler Seguin, Jamie Benn are both UFAs after this year. They're going to be aging out soon. I mean, the Central Division is an absolute gauntlet with the other teams that they have to deal with, like Colorado, Minnesota, Utah, starting to take steps forward as well. So, Mike, in your opinion, do you think that the Dallas Stars Stanley Cup window is closing?
There's no team in the NHL more in favor of the conference playoff format than the Dallas Stars because of the way that their division is. It's unfair that every year they have to play Minnesota or Colorado in the first round. It pretty much eliminates any opportunity for them to win the Stanley Cup. By the time they get to the Western Conference final, they're gassed. You're right. They didn't do much in the offseason. In fact, they traded Maverick Bourque, who scored 20 goals for them last year. Age is starting to creep in, not only with the veteran guys like Duchesne and Seguin and Ben, but, the Robertsons and the Rupe Hinzes are getting into their mid to late 20s. They're in their prime, and they haven't won yet. And Jake Ottinger hasn't stolen a playoff series when it really counted in the Western Conference final. So, yeah, I think the window is closing, and I don't know how much they can really do about it.
Yeah, it is unfortunate. They are a victim of circumstance a lot of the times, but obviously, they made the coaching change last year. They otherwise have not made a ton of changes to their roster. They've struggled to stay healthy in the past. I mean, Kelsey, do you think that this year, you think this is it for them before that window starts to slam shut, or do you think that they still have a good opportunity here?
I think this is much like the Oilers, maybe not necessarily the same exact situation, but I do think this is kind of a make it or break it year for them. Because, beyond the fact, I know a lot of people were talking about the Jason Robertson situation, him signing to that 1-year deal rather than signing long-term. I think there's a reason for that other than giving them more time to work out a long-term extension. I think he wants to stay in Dallas, but I think it's also worth noting that, like Mike said, this team is starting to age out a little bit. They have a lot of unrestricted free agents next season. And also, too, some of these guys that are aging out still play key roles in their lineup, and they're not going to be easy to replace. And they're going to be faced with a decision on whether or not they're going to bring some of these guys back and try to run it back with an older core or older players on the periphery of the roster, or if they're going to try to swap them out for younger guys. And that's the whole catch here. Do they have again, they're a team that doesn't really have much going for them in the asset pool. So trading is going to be a little bit difficult without moving some talent out in the future. So I do think this is kind of a make it or break it year for them, and it could determine what Robertson decides in January and if he's going to stay long-term with the Dallas Stars. Do I think they're going to be in the playoff picture? Absolutely. I don't think this team is going to suddenly regress and not be a playoff team. But it's worth considering what those next years look like and, where they go from here. And I do think that this might be the last legitimate season of their contention window, their Stanley Cup contention window. and they're going to have to get over that Colorado hump just one time. They're going to have to hopefully get a quicker series or two leading up to the conference final in order for them to go all the way. But yeah, I am concerned about the age of this roster and how they kind of work around that starting next season.
Well, and like I said, the Central Division is an absolute gauntlet. And, you know, now that we're into the you know, kind of the middle to late part of August here, most of the big moves of the offseason have been made already. We talked about Dallas being one of those teams that really didn't make a lot of moves. They were pretty quiet this offseason. So if we're looking at the Central Division as a whole, Mike, we're talking teams like Colorado, Minnesota, Utah, Nashville, Winnipeg, St. Louis. I mean, all of these teams in the Central Division. Who do you think has had the best offseason in terms of their offseason moves? Noting that, of course, great offseason doesn't necessarily mean great season. But if you're just looking at the moves made this offseason, who do you think had the best and the worst offseason just in the Central Division?
Okay, in the Central, I think the St. Louis Blues had the best offseason. They had Connor McMichael. They moved out Kyrou, but they had Connor McMichael. They had Mason McTavish, on Brandon Carlo on defense. And I think those additions, you know, both McTavish and McMichael can play center. They may not because they have Robert Thomas there, but I think those moves were excellent, and they could contend for a wild card spot. In terms of worst, I mean, I'll say Dallas, but I'll give an honorable mention because of everything we just talked about with Dallas. The honorable mention might be the Chicago Blackhawks because they way overpaid for Bowen Byram. Not only return, but salary. They way overpaid for Patrick Kane, and the moves that they made were basically Band-Aids on a bullet hole. They're still not anywhere close to being a contender, and they should be with the young talent that they've drafted over the last few years.
Kelsey, what do you think? Best and worst offseason in the Central Division?
So I did like the St. Louis Blues offseason as well, but I'm actually going to go with the Utah Mammoth here. I like a lot of the moves that they made. They obviously got some guys under contract. They re-signed John Marino. Obviously, Logan Cooley has been signed to that massive extension as well. They acquired Vincent Trocheck. They got Anders Lee. So, I mean, I think in essence, they're improving the weak areas of their roster. They're a lot stronger down the middle than they were last season. I do think they might still need a little bit of a better situation in goal, at least a better tandem there. But I mean, I like what this team's doing. I think that this is a playoff team again this year. I think this is a team that's going to keep improving. And I like their offseason so far. And actually, Mike, I'm going to go with Chicago for the worst offseason because to me, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily. I think the overpayment for Patrick Kane makes a little bit more sense, just given his stature with the organization. They needed some veteran presence. They're obviously needed to fill in some cap space, but I still will never understand that extension for Bowen Byram. That's a vast overpayment. I think in parts of their roster, they're investing money in the wrong places, and that might come back to bite them, even with the rising cap. I don't think they've done enough to really take a substantial step forward. So I would grade them as the worst offseason only because they overpaid and they didn't get a whole lot in terms of adding to the actual roster and bolstering their standings place. So I don't think this is a playoff team, and it's still probably not going to be a playoff team for a few more years unless they start to course correct a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of money getting thrown around in Chicago. I mean, paying $4 million to probably a third pairing defenseman in Ian Cole as well. It just seems like a lot of overpaying happening there. But let's look over at the Pacific Division now. Mike, of the offseason moves that have been made, which Pacific Division team do you think has had the best and the worst offseason?
Clear winner, the San Jose Sharks. Not only adding Stenberg, but Mason Marchment, Darnell Nurse, Jacob Trouba, Kesselring to a lesser extent on the blue line. They've added veteran players who will protect the youngsters. And, you know, Stenberg is probably another core player. They may, you know, maybe he'll do something good this year, but probably down a few years down the road. In terms of worst, the Edmonton Oilers. They added Mike Babcock. That's the worst move of the season by any team, was the addition of Mike Babcock.
All right, Kelsey, your thoughts.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with what the San Jose Sharks have done this offseason. I might be in the minority here, but I think they could push for a playoff spot this season. I think they're ready to take that next step. I think their offseason moves show that they're trying to take that next step legitimately this season. And as Mike said, I think an underrated aspect of this, I still think they overpaid for the Trouba contract. I don't like that at all. And obviously they got Nurse. It's not necessarily a bad move as long as he's playing in a more sheltered role. But I mean, as Mike said, I think it's important that they have somebody like Trouba to protect their young stars and have that assurance. They kind of have that dose of meanness now on their blue line. I think that will serve them well, especially with such a young roster. But I see some of these guys taking even further steps next season. And like I said, I think this is a team that's ready to take the next step, and it wouldn't surprise me if they're in the playoff conversation, given some of the moves they've made this offseason. As far as the worst offseason, I mean, I don't mean to keep agreeing with Mike, but it's hard to get over the Edmonton Oilers hiring Mike Babcock and not really doing much to improve their roster. Otherwise, again, much so a lateral offseason. They didn't really do anything to separate themselves or get themselves over the hump that's been kind of haunting them over the last couple of years. I didn't love LA's offseason either so far. I expected them to maybe do a little bit more just because I do think their window of contention is closing. And we're getting, to the point where the LA Kings may not be a playoff team in the next couple of years. So I would have liked to see them do a little bit more than they did this offseason. So if I had to pick two, it's the LA Kings and the Edmonton Oilers for the worst.
Well, every offseason in the NHL has got its share of major headline making moves, but there are the blockbuster trades and the massive free agent contracts, and some teams have found value in players who are coming in off of down seasons. We've seen that before. Other teams have targeted specific areas of need to improve their rosters. A couple have taken chances on players who could have considerably more responsibilities in their new surroundings now. So Mike, if you're looking at all the acquisitions and moves in totality this offseason around the league, are there any kind of under the radar, not necessarily headline making moves, but under the radar acquisitions that you think are going to be able to make a big impact for their team next season?
Yeah, a couple in the West. Blake Coleman to Minnesota. I think he fits in as a middle six winger, or maybe even can play center with that team. That's a really good ad. Jaden Schwartz in Colorado. He was injured for, I think, about 30 games last year, but can still score at age 34. And if they play him in the top six role, I mean, that might be a good fit. And in the East, Nick Paul in Toronto. I think that that ad as a third line center, providing size, a guy who has playoff experience. I mean, he's really going to help in that bottom six for the Leafs, which they had the worst or second worst bottom six in the NHL last year.
Kelsey, any under the radar moves additionally that you think are going to make a big impact this season?
Well, I kind of mentioned a couple before. Like I said, I like the moves that the Utah Mammoth made to add Vincent Trocheck and Anders Lee. I think those are going to be two pretty big acquisitions for them. Like I said, to shore up their center depth, I think it gives them a lot of veteran experience, some guys that have been there in the playoffs as well, that kind of know what it is to make a little bit of a run. So I'm looking at those two guys as big additions for Utah. And I'm going to bring it back home to Pittsburgh, too. I really like this Kuzmenko signing. And I do think this is kind of, again, this is something that could end up panning out for them if he does stay healthy. He did score 39 goals in his rookie season next to Elias Pettersson. If he can get some time with Crosby up on the top line, I do think that he could replicate that production. And again, it depends on his health. But if he can be something similar to what Anthony Mantha was to them last season, I think he's definitely a guy that can help propel them to the playoffs. So yeah, those are the two I'm looking at. And then Mike already mentioned the Paul acquisition in Toronto. I think that's going to be good for them as well. They really needed to add some depth. So I think he helps them on the forward front, and that'll be a good move for them.
Well, and you talked earlier about the Dallas Stars and play that they haven't really made many moves, but one of the moves they did was get rid of Maverick Bourque. I think that's going to be a big acquisition in Nashville. He's going to make a big impact, as well as Jack Drury, talking about shoring up center depth, doing what you can there. So lots of sort of under the radar names to keep an eye on here as we head into the season. Want to wrap up here today, kind of taking a look back. We're now a little over 4 years since the 2022 NHL Draft that was held in Montreal. And if we look back at those original top 5 picks, and we've already talked about some of them here on the show today, but number 1 to Montreal was Juraj Slafkovsky. Then you've got Simon Nemec to New Jersey at number 2, Logan Cooley in Arizona at number 3, Shane Wright to Seattle at number 4, and Cutter Gauthier to Philadelphia at number 5. So looking back at this class now, Mike, anyone who you think should enter that top 5 over these players? Because they've all had pretty different trajectories.
Yeah, I mean, Nemec, I'm not ready to quit on Nemec or Wright. They haven't really come to the forefront yet, but I think Nemec in Calgary is going to get an opportunity. And Shane Wright, if he gets traded, I think he could still bounce back and be an effective player. But the clear player to come up into that top 5 is Lane Hutson. Lane Hutson was picked late in the second round, and covering the Leafs, I was, like Kyle Dubas. That one screamed Kyle Dubas. Small player with speed and skill, and he passed on him for Fraser Minten, and then he goes to Montreal late in the second round. If you look at Montreal and their success now, Slafkovsky and Hutson with their first 2 picks is a big reason why. And if an honorable mention would be Jimmy Snuggerud, who was picked 23rd. I think he's going to be a really good player, and maybe he could have moved up, but that would have been a big jump.
Kelsey, any changes you would make now with the benefit of hindsight, looking back at this top 5?
I'm actually not sure that I would make any changes. I think Mike kind of said it. I'm not ready to give up on Shane Wright at this point. And, I think maybe the order of the top 5 would have changed for me. But I think the right 5 are there. But he also mentioned Snuggerud. He's going to be a really good hockey player, I think, for a really long time, and he's showing a lot so far, just age 22. And he's going to be a really big piece of the St. Louis Blues team going forward. So if there was a player that I would move into the top 5, it would be him. But I don't necessarily think at the time, that's the benefit of hindsight, right? We can look back at this and say, look at what Jimmy Snuggerud's doing, but I don't think anybody thought that he was going to pan out the way he did. And that's still kind of a question mark going forward, but he looks to be a good player for a long time. So there was one guy to move into the top 5, I'd say him. But if anything, I might change the order a little bit. But I think the right 5 guys are there.
All right. Well, if you want to read any more about any of the players, the teams, the topics, looking back at that 22 draft, anything that we've talked about here today, please head over to the Hockey News. It's been the go-to for all things hockey since 1947. 12 issues packed with game and player insights, plus a free issue to start. It's a must-have for any fan. Head to thn.com/free. Grab your subscription today. That is going to do it for today's episode of The Wraparound. Thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today. We really do appreciate it. We'll be back with an all-new episode next week. But for now, for Michael Augello and Kelsey Surmacz, I'm Emma Lingan. This is The Wraparound, and we will see you next time.